lightning inside me, son of a god. I'm like a titan that's rising, oh, just you watch. I'm stepping into fate, there is no time to waste. I've got that lightning inside me, this is how legends are made.
Okay, well that went down reasonably well. Now I've just got to dig a hole in the world and lay low for a while as rebels and military police dogpile on the area to search for me. They're pretty excited to make me pay for what just happened, but this isn't my first rodeo, so I'm just gonna lay still here, give us a chance to chat about why I just took the course of action that I did. One of the things I know about purpose-built roadblocks is there's several obstructive layers designed to stop people from being able to blow through them. I mean, that's the whole point. So the absence of any additional vehicles, mounted or dismounted machine guns covering the approach, ESCO-style or concrete barriers, no spike strips, not to mention no additional security forces, all of this suggested this wasn't in fact a disciplined federal or military police roadblock. This was just a couple of dudes shaking down some locals for trinkets and beer money for the weekend. It wasn't the first time I've seen this happen. These guys may not have even known what went down yesterday, and better yet, they may not even care. So one of the things working in my favor in dealing with these clowns is that I'd been in the region a few times over the years in different capacities, and in some cases I even worked with a tactical crisis resolution unit known as UTARC or Unidad. They'd been disbanded once for rampant corruption and being a little too over the top with the rough stuff back in 2009. This unit was reborn in 2015 when I came to Bolivia the first time, and this gave me some valuable insights on what I was dealing with. I also knew a lot about that type of APC and the limitations of its weapon system, the optics, the loader, and the ammo. Yeah, it's an ominous, imposing presence to an untrained, unarmed person, but if you know a few things about it, you realize they're mostly for show. Characteristically, they had weak engines and generally performed poorly in the uphill environment, but with fresh tires, they had reasonable braking power and decent downhill performance. Don't even get me started about the weapon system. The guys I'd worked with back in the day with UTARC or Unidad never stopped complaining about how the new optics never did work very well, and they typically just used bore sight. The loading mechanism was a mechanical nightmare. Nobody had an interest in learning, and the ammo may as well have been stored underwater. And maybe they'd fixed this since I last worked with them, but I doubt it. Most of the Unidad had evolved into entitled brats who weren't particularly interested in that side of the job. Most made a living from looking the other way and squeezing as much money out of the gig as they could. There was little interest to use these vehicles as anything more than a tool to bully the weak, just like what I was doing today. And they did really well at protest rallies, making noise and breaking up crowds, but beyond that, they just weren't a credible threat. Regardless of all this, I still figured I'd increase my odds of success by assuming everything was going to work perfectly. I decided going uphill to my right was going to be better than running downhill to my left, where the vehicle may have had a better chance of catching me out in the open and mowing me down like grass. The other option I'd contemplated was staying in the vehicle and hitting the ditch on my right to YOLO through to the other side, hoping to have enough of the element of surprise stocked up to make it through. I may not have had AC, but I had a 4x4, so I figured I might be able to negotiate the ditch. I couldn't see much of it. I could only see a couple of vehicles ahead on that side. There were just a lot of unknowns. Additionally, the guys inspecting the vehicles would likely open fire on me as I went by. The Unidad may be a little bit more disciplined based on what I'd witnessed back in Libertad, but from what I saw from the rebels, there's no way I was putting civilians in that crossfire. Yes, my survival was paramount, but if I got a bunch of innocent civilians killed while I was at it, I might as well be wearing a Unidad uniform. Civilians right now were my clutch concern. Individual people are generally intelligent, at least insofar as their own well-being is concerned. Most act predictably within their risk tolerance, but mobs of confused, panicked people are Fucking idiots. One thing I knew for certain is that when this thing went down, I wanted to try to get as much separation as I could between them and the line of fire. I knew the Unidad guys were putting on a show, but still just hating their life underneath all that bubble wrap with their fart sniffers on. There was no wind, and it was already 20 degrees centigrade outside. No peripheral vision. They're slow, with all that armor on. Tough nut to crack with a pistol, which at that point at least was my most accessible weapon. The element I worried about and that were difficult to predict were the rebels. Professionals are predictable, but the world is full of amateurs. Yeah, even from that distance, I could see one guy walking the line of cars with his finger resting on the trigger. The slightest agitation would cause him to squeeze it reflexively, and I wasn't going to be able to control where that bullet went as a result. I knew this meant I was going to have to dump him first, and I'd have rounds going into the other guy before I even hit the ground. I saw the two guys were just leapfrogging along the cars, talking to drivers and simultaneously checking out the insides of their vehicles looking for loot. I'd actually briefly contemplated just waiting this out and hoping to draw so little attention to myself they'd just move along. I'd smile and nod. I had nothing in the vehicle. Or did I? I realized I hadn't even looked in the back seat. What was in the box? No clue. Something, nothing. Can't see anything in the rearview mirror, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there that won't grab their attention. Never mind that Wax told me my Spanish was about as bad as his French, but I knew there was no way I'd survive a conversation, and by then my element of surprise would have evaporated. So, I waited until the rebel had moved a little closer, a couple cars up, while the Unidad guy peeked in the back window, and I made my move. And here we are. I'd made it, but it's like I'd just kicked a hornet's nest and now had to stand still while I pissed on it. The choppers showed up first. Some dropped off rebel and Unidad troops around the area, while others swept back and forth trying to get a glimpse of me out in the open. Don't think they even really knew what they were looking for. I'm doubtful anybody really got a good look at me. I was up that hill 100 meters down the tracks before I even heard the APC engine throttle up. Everybody else was ducking for cover in their vehicles, trying to keep their heads down. So I ran as far as I could with poor-fitting pants crawling inside me before I heard the first helicopter approach. From there, I looked for the best hiding spot I could find and stayed the fuck away from it. The other issue I knew I was going to have to deal with was the fact I hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. Dump a couple adrenaline rushes on that and the ugliest 3-kilometer run anyone has ever done cross-country, and I knew low blood sugar was going to start impacting my ability to function both physically and mentally. I'd survived plenty on 24 hours without sleep, but now I had to lay perfectly still, probably for hours, until this storm blew over. Falling asleep was going to really dig into my odds of survival, but fortunately I had a couple of Dexedrines in my pocket. One of the few things I was able to salvage from my blowout kit before I changed into pants I found in that back alley dumpster in Libertad. Most armed forces had moved on to modafinil, and the Ds were removed from the approved list because they worked a little too well, and at that point I was counting on it. They had some side effects, but I'd learned to work through those. Hydration was the other stupid problem that was bugging me. The only thing more likely to kill me on this hillside than the Unidad bozos was the fact I had no access to water for the foreseeable future. Talk about rookie mistakes. I had a fucking camelback on my back and I hadn't had a chance to fill it up yet. With humidity hovering around 80%, sweat wasn't evaporating. Even though it felt like I could drink the air, this was actually working against me in that hoodie and dark pants. I was lying there sweating more in spite of it having no effect. Fuck's sakes. I'd flick the middle finger at homeostasis if it wasn't for the fact that I was certain the slightest movement would give me away. So I'm stuck on the hillside, unable to move, probably for the rest of the day. I was so hungry my large intestine was eating the small one, badly dehydrated from past exertion, heat, humidity, and a Dexedrine I'd gulped down an hour ago. And the Dexedrine was causing me to feel hyper-alert while swaying somewhat disturbingly between horny and depressed. I was hanging on for the ride, but wow, was I ever a mess. I laid still, reflecting on my situation. I'm not sure if I'd been good or just lucky, but there comes a point where it just doesn't even matter. I was looking around me for anything I might be able to scavenge. I'd been through a 13-hour fast between supper and what was supposed to be breakfast the day before. We hadn't made it that far before things went haywire, and that was concerning. There were a few mushrooms sprouting nearby, but I couldn't remember which would fill me, kill me, pill me, or spill me. There's a whole process where you test it on your skin, and then on your lips, and on your tongue, and if you hadn't had some sort of reaction, then you just go for it. But after all that, there just wasn't enough to eat at this point to matter anyway. My last sea romp felt like a billion years ago. It was on a different continent when I didn't need a liter of just for men to keep the gray out of my beard. I'd eaten some gruesome things in my life to survive, in training and even in real life. Anyone who's had to choke down a chicken a la King MRE knows there's a variety of juicy bugs that offer tasty alternatives. But I wanted to believe I was a long way from going down that road. I did a quick inventory. I hadn't pissed in about 16 hours, so I knew that wasn't good. The back end was in good shape. I was a once every couple of day guy anyway. The hunger was definitely aggravating my situation, but the D tended to taper that a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I was still nutrient depleted, but less focused on it. On the plus side, Unidad didn't have much of an appetite for this hillside bullshit, which is one of the reasons why I picked the spot I did. Rebels, on the other hand, they ate this stuff up and just dabbled it under their armpits. They'd be here for a while, so I stayed still and just let it play out. I just kept thinking to myself, don't try to create opportunity, just be prepared to seize it. I also needed to really work at staying perfectly calm, and this isn't easy. Stress may be a choice, but it can be a very convincing one depending on how adept you are at dealing with it. There's a technique that we use called tactical breathing, or autogenic breathing, and this can help regulate stress-related increases in your heartbeat. As a species, we evolved a stress response that enabled some physiological damage control. Most of this reverts back to basic fight-or-flight instincts. If we're getting all amped up to fight, then constriction in our vasculature will help minimize bleeding in the event we get an arm lopped off by a battle axe. Or if we're in a flight profile and we're fleeing a saber-toothed tiger, we'd fill our pants with chicken a la King and make ourselves as unappealing as possible. Look up Dr. Dave Grossman's work on the topic, but to paraphrase, the heart has a couple of stress-related throttle settings. Emotionally resting gets you up to about 100 beats per minute, where you start to enter the upper range of fine motor skills and cognition. From 120 to about 140 or so, you lose some fine motor skills, but in general terms, if you're hard charging a problem, this isn't a bad place to be. I wouldn't do brain surgery, but I'd definitely go on a mission at that rate. As things start to deteriorate and you get up to 160, a lot of your overall response is going to depend on your experience and training. This can be where severe cognitive degeneration starts to set in and deterioration of your auditory and visual complexes. Once you start ticking over 180, you're pretty much off the chain. A lot of this stems from the constriction of your vasculature, which significantly impairs blood flow to the brain, with often detrimental results. I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but there's a good reason. Top-tier operators, emergency responders, individuals in high-stress occupations don't just flick a switch and turn all this stuff off. They manage it, and you can too if you know how. There are only a few things we can do both consciously and subconsciously, or sympathetically and parasympathetically. Most relevant in this context is breathing. We can actually regulate our heartbeat if we control our breathing, making tactical breathing incredibly relevant to everyone. Anyone on the job ever tell you to breathe when they need you to settle the fuck down? This is why. You can bet my whole life at that moment on that hilltop revolved around tactical breathing, focusing on deep, controlled cycles of all the way in, hold full, all the way out, hold empty, and repeat. Usually you only need a few cycles to get a grip, but I hadn't stopped since I saw the roadblock. I knew my heart rate was still sitting around 120 and 140 and was gradually coming down. Some of this was stress, but there's some other elements were physical and out of my control. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, empty for 4. not sure if the Dexedrine was playing games with me, but I felt like I got sucked through a wormhole where I got torn between watching seconds take minutes with the sun beating me to death to coming out the other side in the dark and relative silence. Did I fall asleep? No clue. But it was really quiet all of a sudden. This didn't mean there was nobody around, but all the big stuff sounded like it had moved on. There were no helicopters, no big motors, no shouting up and down the hill, and thank fuck there were no dogs. I must have smelled like a rotten salami sandwich marinating in dog piss. Where am I going? Am I still heading southwest to the refugee camp? Yes, it does make sense for now, but it's still a gamble. Would the others head there? Would the folks who wanted us dead think of it? I didn't think so. We deployed to that area to retrieve some sensitive equipment in a plane crash that happened on a mountain nearby and pretty much stumbled into that camp by accident. I got no sense that anyone at any level had any idea that it was there, which is probably why it was still there. It was a solid choice for me, and I hope the guys would think so too. I just wish we'd had that chat. Hey guys, if the balloon pops, then let's pick a spot that only we know about. What would that have taken? 10 seconds? Fuck. Fucking idiot. It was starting to cool off, but I'd stopped sweating a long time ago, so I knew I was going to need to do something about that. I could scavenge for sips of water, maybe chew on some leaves, but the effort would likely result in me being spotted or would exhaust more moisture than I could replace. Just a little bit longer. My ass was asleep and my feet felt like they were in a different time zone. I was going to need to take things very, very slowly. I started to hear creatures of the night clicking and chirping. I didn't hear any birds either, which suggested to me that things were settling down nicely. There were no disturbances, just the sound of air going in and out of my nose and the sound of my heart between my ears. All right, it's time to move. It took a bit of convincing, but I eventually pulled myself together enough to start moving back down the hill. Of all the stupid things I could do, going back down the side of the hill towards the road where everything went down was at the top of the list. So that's exactly what I did. I knew the general layout since I'd already done one pass, and I was confident I could move quickly and quietly. And then what? No sense planning anything. I was just going to need to fall back on instinct as the world played out around me. But from a priority standpoint, water was at the very top of the list. Assuming someone doesn't get the jump on me and unceremoniously feed me a green wiener, it shouldn't be hard. I just need to take it easy, slow it down. Don't get impatient. I kept that program relatively intact until I came across the first small stream. Then, dude, get it in you, as they say, and I did. I drank so much I ended up throwing most of it back up. One of the things that I always struggled with was a terrible puker. Guys I worked with called my toothbrush a gag stick since I'd be standing there brushing my teeth and dry heaving loud enough to make other guys gag. Back in 2013, I was in an MRAP that got fragged by an IED and headed for Abrams, and that kicked my ass. I ended up with a pretty bad concussion, so I was pretty sick. I made such a racket at the forward operating base, guys zeroing their weapons on the range out back came to see what was going on. I'd had a few nicknames over the years, none of them particularly flattering as they seldom are, but unfortunately the only one that stuck was Puke and Dog, or Puke for short. At least it was better than Ragged, which was the one that had preceded it when I was in Iraq. If you don't know the story of the gerbil and the paper towel roll, suffice to say, some guys put the first letters of my full name together, and I spent a decade of guys making jokes about how I was on fire, and I could literally build a fort out of the Armageddon DVDs I was given. Just type gerbil and Armageddon in Google. It was a long 10 years all over the world for me. Anyway, puking was just my thing. I suppressed as much of it as I could, short of trying to cram it through my nose, which I will say I don't do anymore because of a severe sinus infection. I got it out of my system as discreetly as I could, and then forced myself to smarten the fuck up. Food's next. I still had my Silence Mark 18, but hunting at night wasn't really a practicable option. I'd found my current wardrobe in a dumpster and figured I could find food in one as well, but I wasn't exactly in an area teeming with dumpsters. There's a base complex up the road a bit. I was sure they wouldn't think anyone on the planet would be that stupid. Seize opportunity, and what the hell? Why not slip out in one of their vehicles? And this bitch had air conditioning. So now I'm back on track. No real clue where I am specifically, but I was more interested in just putting some distance between me and my last seen location. I had a rough idea of what direction I was going, just looking at the stars. So I stuck to back roads that headed roughly that way. I'd long since pitched my phone purely out of an abundance of caution, given that the whole situation was unreal and I was absolutely certain it was one way they kept an eye on us during deployment. Luckily, I did find a gas station, which was closed, but I was able to second a map from there. I locked up the place as best I could before I left. My issue isn't with the people of Bolivia. Once I had the map, the rest was pretty easy. I was actually a bit surprised how little distance I'd put between me and Libertad. I mentally backtracked my original escape route. Rough area of the house, few turns from there to the roadblock. I knew better than to put any marks on the map, but I drilled it into my brain. My situation was starting to come together now, and it was time to get a grip on the fact this whole thing doesn't just involve me. I've got 3 other guys I'm responsible for. I haven't even seen BLT since the night before last. Wax had taken to the river behind the house and went upstream. Hotmail bailed in roughly the same direction. I was pretty confident they could handle themselves, but I needed to get some sort of idea if BLT had been taken or if he managed to make it out. If Wax or Hotmail asked me what happened, I couldn't put myself in the position to say, I don't know, I didn't check. And they'd say, why not? And I wouldn't have an answer. I at least needed to try. Maybe it would help me piece things together. One thing I'd learned a long time ago was the benefit of a blowout cache within about 5 kilometers of the main operating area. Basically, you'd store a choice of weapons, ammo, vest, and whatever odds and ends were relevant to your operating environment. You never told anyone where it was, so no matter how badly things blew up in your face, it was as reliable a place as you could make. This was where preparing outweighed planning. Someone with the right set of skills can do a lot with the right gear. But if you strip them of all that, we all pretty much just downgrade to civilians. Paramedic without all their magic beans is just a first aider. Knowing all the things that need to be done to save a life, but without any tools to do it. I took an hour to retrieve my cache and got some things together for later. It wasn't time to change my clothing just yet, but as I emerged from my prey response looking for answers, I knew I was going to need to switch back to offense. One thing I will say, I might puke really loud, but I don't lounge around on defense if I don't need to. I loaded up the vehicle with some bits that would add tactical capacity to my path forward and headed back towards Libertad. As I drove into Libertad, I had to remind myself that over a day and a half had gone by. I was expecting to see remnants of the ambush, but as I got closer to the safe house, I saw there was very little in the way of evidence that it even happened. I did a drive-by of the place and saw it was dark. They may have had a stag on it, but I doubted any Unidad or rebel for that matter was going to be burning a Thursday night just sitting around here with a thumb up their ass on the off chance that any of us were stupid enough to come back. I did a few casual passes down nearby streets and nothing was triggering my spidey senses. I took my time. Eventually I had cased the place out enough to satisfy even my most paranoid inner voice, and I just went for it. Once I broke the exterior plane, I drew my sidearm and cleared the house. Nothing. It was tossed a little, but I knew if there'd been a struggle, there would have been plenty of evidence. BLT was a fucking psycho, so he wasn't going to go down alive, and he'd have to have been spread all over this place by the time he did. There'd be guts and brains all over the place, his and theirs. There was one real obvious sign to me that he'd made it out under his own power. One bottle of Crown Royal I'd brought down for him that he'd hidden away was gone. It was no guarantee. I mean, anybody could have taken it, but my gut was telling me he at least made it out okay and had the bottle of Crown Royal with him. As I was standing there looking around the room, I heard somebody moving around downstairs, and that was when a voice I recognized called up, "Armageddon!" Fuck you. Wax and Hotmail came up the stairs with big smiles on their faces. I was relieved, but feigning annoyance, shaking my head at them in disgust. They knew better, and we hugged it out. I asked if they knew where BLT was, and they didn't have a clue. We knew there was no benefit to standing around talking about it, so we carefully made our way back outside and jumped into our separate vehicles. We agreed that we'd meet outside the city, and from there we'd start getting our next steps organized for a trip out to the refugee camp and decide what to do about BLT.